Thanks very much. I'm not sure quite how to follow that up, really. We, perhaps by saying we all have crosses to bear. I'd like to start with, what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about the character of the Scandinavian colonization of Orkney, to a degree in comparative perspective, particularly talking about the Isle of Man and Iceland briefly at the end. And to start off with, though, I think it's worth a brief digression, and I hope that you humour me with this. I did my PhD at University of Glasgow. I started in 1991, and I did it on the economy of the Norse earldom of Orkney. Before that, I had worked briefly as a student for Parks Canada at Annapolis Royal, which was the capital of initially the French colony of Acadia, and subsequently of the Scottish and ultimately British colony of Nova Scotia. And in that context, I became particularly interested and retained an interest in a fascinating man named William Alexander, who some of you might know about. He was the first Earl of Stirling. William actually made his name as a poet. He was a writer, he was a scholar. But amongst other things, he helped James VI render the Psalms as verse. And in other context, he became a close confidant in court. He had the courts of both James VI and ultimately Charles I. And it was in that context that he gradually consolidated his aspiration to create a colony, a Scottish colony in the New World, the colony of Nova Scotia. He was awarded the charter in 1621, and the first ship sailed in 1622. Now, as happens, that ship was blown off course, ended up at St. John's, Newfoundland, and didn't reach its goal. William sent out another ship in 1623 to meet it, to help establish the colony. But unfortunately, a proportion of the first crew had passed away the intervening year, and rather than being able to establish the colony, both ships ultimately returned to Scotland. At that point, poor William was £6,000 in debt through the enterprise. He had to do something. In 1624, he published a rather utopian text trying to gather support for this enterprise, in which he talked about it as being a mechanism to spread the gospel. He talked about it as being a mechanism to encourage rightful commerce, and he talked about it as an opportunity to acquire the contemplative life. And with this pitch, he fundraised in ways that many of you might know about, and ultimately, in 1628, he was able to send a next expedition, which was ultimately successful in establishing 2 forts. Very unfortunately for William, the wider realpolitik of Europe overcame him, and early in the 1630s it was necessary for the colonies in the New World to be ceded to France, and that was the end of it for now. Poor old William, through this venture and others, ultimately died the extraordinary sum of over £160,000 in debt. Now, fast forward to 1710, into another enterprise by Samuel Vetch, Edinburgh-born Samuel Vetch, who wished to become governor of Nova Scotia, to re-establish the colony, which in the intervening period had been maintained as French Acadia. Now, he briefly succeeded in his goal, becoming governor of Nova Scotia, but he too was essentially ruined by it, and he died in debtor's prison. Now, subsequent to that, the colony, you might all know, I come from Nova Scotia, so subsequent to that, the colony proved quite difficult to govern through the combination of dealings with the Mi'kmaq people, and the complexities also of dealing with the entrenched Acadian French. And much power on the ground in the 18th century continued to reside with the local Mi'kmaq and with the Acadians, and with, in fact, the Catholic priesthood. And in that context, colonial policies had become increasingly aggressive, to the point of what many of you may be familiar with, the rather infamous event in 1755, when 7,000 Acadians were deported and dispersed en masse to around the other North American colonies of the British North America. Now, that event, that particularly unfortunate event perhaps, of course was not ultimately unsuccessful in destroying the community of the Acadians or their allies, the Mi'kmaq, because both the Acadians and the First Nations community of Nova Scotia remain very important components of the culture of the province today. Now, I started with that perhaps overly long digression because I wanted to introduce several straightforward aspects of settler colonialism, which of course is how we have to imagine the Scandinavian settlement of the Northern Isles in the event that we imagine people moved. And I think now most of us accept that we actually did move. There's a period in time where perhaps we questioned it. And these, of course, are characteristic of the story, the anecdote I've just told about Nova Scotia, but are also widely accepted by social scientists in terms of the nature of settler colonialism more broadly. Of course, every aspect doesn't apply equally in all instances. The first is that it is highly capital intensive. It isn't achieved by a man and woman and their dog. The second is that it's underpinned by aspirations that are always in part utopian. Most migrants, unless forced migrants, are seeking to create a better life for themselves, and in many cases they convince themselves that they're also seeking to create a better life for those who happen to be the places that they're going. Colonialism is also often associated with a religious ideology, and it's in fact been empirically demonstrated that colonies that are set up with a religious underpinning, chronologically speaking, are far more likely to succeed than those which have a secular underpinning in terms of the number of years, etc. The fourth point is that, of course, settler colonialism always has a dark side, and that is a dark side for the people who happen to get in the way. And it has mechanisms to deal with those, and those mechanisms are very often what are broadly referred to as othering, in some way making it entirely legitimate to take that which had previously, including in certain instances the freedom or the life of those who previously occupied or controlled that territory. And of course, if you happen to have an Iron Age or early medieval warrior mentality, which includes a slaving mentality, then that process is very easy. If you conquer somebody, they are by right subject to slavery and enslavement. And the fifth is that despite all of the above, settler colonialism very rarely unfolds as intended. It's very rarely successful in the utopian aspirations, often, of course, unequal utopian aspirations in which it was set out, leading to new, sometimes hybrid identities. Well, having set that out, I'd like to think about the way in which we sometimes imagine the settlement of the Northern Isles, which is not really in those terms. And of course, there's such a diversity of opinion that it is entirely unfair to say that this is a kind of paradigm that that is entrenched, that I'm in some way going to sweep aside. Of course, that's not true. This is a straw person, if you like, a straw man. But it doesn't mislead. And the first is that there is a long entrenched notion of gradualism, which goes back to the Icelandic sources of the Middle Ages, whereby the Northern Isles were stepping stones for further piracy and colonization, and they represent a kind of wave in advance of Scandinavian colonization. The second is that initial settlement is often attributed to the period of small-scale raiding in the West in the late 8th or first half of the 9th century, when we really are dealing in the first instance with relatively small numbers, 3 ships in Portland, for instance, in the late 8th. And the next is that initial settlement is sometimes, not always of course, thought to have been comparatively peaceful in the first instance, with conflict, demonstrable conflict of course, then emerging with the establishment of the earldom of Orkney, and of course the various dates suggested of when that might have been. I've plucked around AD 900 for the sake of convenience. And the last is that the subsequent culture is often thought to have been assertively Norse, as Skaldic poetry, soapstone vessels, etc., rather than hybrid, after a period of interface, which relates to that potentially peaceful period before. And as I say, these are not universal, and I'm not being specifically critical of the proponents of any one of them. You'll recognize my own ideas amongst them. Perhaps I should be most critical of those. But they are all out there in terms of the historiography. So what I'd like to do, in light of my initial anecdote, is to explore some alternatives. The first is that the settlement was a short-term, planned event by an aspirational group or groups with a particular vision of what they hoped to achieve. That is, it was guided in part by the goal of establishing a new society. The utopian of my title. I don't want to push the utopian ideas too far. Of course, it's in part simply a provocative way to make us think in what might or might not be a new way. And the last is that the dark side of utopian experiencing othering was both unsuccessful and successful. What is the evidence? Well, I'd like to explore in turn texts, say a few words about ships, a very few words about burials and hoards, equally briefly consider ecclesiastical sites, spend a little bit more time on settlement sites, two of which that I've excavated myself, I'll explore briefly, and then finally wrap up with the comparative cases of the Isle of Man and Iceland I mentioned before. And in each of these we have to think about the issues of chronology. Was this early? Was this late? If it's late, could it perhaps be rapid? Think about costs, think about aspirations, think about ideologies, think about othering, and think about ambiguity and hybridity. And of course, one can't think about all of those themes for every category of evidence. Some illuminates others to differing degrees. Okay, let's start off with the historical evidence. And this is a bit of a review of what in many ways we already know, but I think it's useful to tell the story. To begin with, of course, the period of raiding starts 793 in Lindisfarne and 794 in the west, and of course continues all the way through the first and perhaps even into the second Viking Age. The question is this the period of settlement? And it has sometimes been suggested that the raid recorded in the Annals of Ulster of 839 would be the period by which there must have been Scandinavian settlement in the Northern Isles, from where it is assumed that raid must have come. Of course, there's no such thing. I mean, there are raids all the way to Aquitaine in 799, and nobody's suggesting that's because there is settlement in Francia at that point. If one looks for the evidence of settlement, one gets a pretty good sense, despite the lack of direct historical evidence relating to the Northern Isles, one gets a pretty good sense from when people were settling everywhere else in Western Europe, where Scandinavians were settling, and that is the middle decades of the 9th century, starting in the 840s, perhaps in Ireland in 841, 842, but it's the same in Aquitaine and Francia. We have the most explicit reference in the Annals of Saint-Bertin, which might refer to the Hebrides, for instance, the islands around Ireland, if you like, England 851, and then we get that interesting reference to the Gaul Gael, who at this date might or might not be localized geographically in Scotland in 856. And of course, by 871, we know something has happened, because at that point, leapfrog settlement of Iceland has begun, in part from the Scandinavian colonies of Britain and Ireland, probably significantly including Scotland. And very interestingly, lastly perhaps in the list is the Isle of Man. So once again, we see that these piratical enclaves can conceivably be quite late in the process rather than early in the process. And if we look for the earliest local historical source, of course it's very difficult to find. The best candidate one has is Skaldic poetry preserved in later Icelandic sources, particularly the so-called Lausavisa, of who might be a historical or maybe a fictional Earl of Orkney, Thorfinar. And these are either actual 10th century verses referring to his defeat of a son of Harald Finehair, semi-mythical founder of this kingdom of Norway, or they might be propaganda created in the 11th or 12th centuries, more likely the 11th, in the context of what the earldom would then become. It almost doesn't matter. The point is that the imagining of this creation of this Scandinavian settlement is one which involves a warrior aristocracy. It's one which involves the explicit rejection of royal power, in this instance the actual slaughtering of the king of Harold Fairhair. And it's one which is imagining the creation of a new society in the islands, which is juxtaposed to those who are stalking sheep back home in Norway. And in terms of the relationship with the indigenous community, I mean, if you have that royal aristocracy, one can imagine what's happening, of course. But in terms of the Pict, one does not, unfortunately, have contemporary account, but one gets echoes of that process of othering that must have come. Because, of course, by the time one hits the synoptic histories of the 12th century, they have been ultimately othered to the point that they are little people who live underground. And they are little people who live underground, which of course makes it perfectly acceptable for them to be totally destroyed, stripped of their long-established dwellings, and for the Scandinavian, in hindsight of course, this is looking backwards, to have made the islands subject to themselves. Of course, if one has a slaving mentality, one doesn't have to turn the Picts into little people who live underground in order to affect settlement colonialism, but of course it probably helps make you feel a little bit better several centuries later. Right, okay, so where are we now? And the last point about the textual evidence is really this whole point about high costs. And where one gets the relevant evidence is unfortunately once again not a Scottish context, an Irish one, but these were not trivial undertakings. Of course, these numbers can't be taken at face value, but nevertheless, they were meant to be large. By the end of the 830s, one has fleets as substantial as 60 ships. In 848, in the Annals of Ulster, there are a whole series of battles which involve losses by Scandinavian raiding parties, which if you topped them all up, add to over 2,000 men. So a bit like William Alexander's enterprises, they cost somebody an awful lot of money. It is when one begins to think about the ships that becomes most clear. Now, unfortunately, of course, the ocean-going vessels of the colonial phenomenon are not preserved in Atlantic Scotland. And the best data for the costs of creating those ships relate to vessels which are not contemporary and are not the same. These are the data for Scuttleb II, which is, of course, a very large 11th century warship made in the Irish Sea region, but we're at least 2 centuries removed here. But even if one scales this down by half or more, we're talking a very, very substantial enterprise. And remember a moment ago, we were talking about fleets that numbered in 60 ships. 50,000 person-hours to build this ship, 87 trees, 130 tons of wood, 3 tons of iron ore, 18 meter cubed of pine tar, etc., 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 etc. And the experimental work has shown that the sail can be as costly to produce as the hull. So these are absolutely capital-intensive enterprises. They cannot have happened as a kind of a peasant migration, if you like. There's got to be some agency behind this, and some agency that controls very substantial wealth. Right, okay, well that's the historical evidence. What of the burial evidence? Well, I don't wish to linger on this, but there are a few key points about the Scandinavian burials. There are about 130 odd from Atlantic Scotland, just under 100 are from the Northern Isles and the adjacent part of Caithness, controlled from Orkney. They've all been shown by James Graham Campbell and Carolyn Patterson to date between about 850 and 950. They're fascinating in a variety of reasons. They're a significant break from that which came before them, and they don't contain diagnostically or characteristically Pictish objects. On the other hand, they aren't characterized by cremation, which would have been expected were they mirroring circumstances in Norway. They do include a few insular items. Here we see an early example of the pin from Westness and the ring pin from Buckwai, graves that essentially span the whole of the chronology from early in Westness to Buckwai in late. And they're graves which lack their corpus as a whole, which lack princely and royal burials of the kind that one would have found in Norway at the same time. So these are explicitly Scandinavian rite, but they are in fact a more egalitarian rite than one would have expected in a Scandinavian context. So we might actually be seeing sort of elements of the kind of ideology that Thorfarner was trying to portray, although I would wish to to push that too far. But the fascinating thing is that it's such a short-lived tradition, both showing that it arrived late, 850 at the earliest, but also that it had disappeared by the point we get Buckwai, which is this very lightly accompanied grave with a coin in it of 940 to 946. The other thing about these graves is that they sometimes cap pre-existing indigenous settlements, Pictish settlements, and Buckwai is a classic example of that. So people are making messages with these, but messages that are perhaps a little bit mixed and a little bit different than the messages they would have been making in Norway. Well, what about the silver hoards? Well, these, of course, pick up a little bit later in the chronology. In the middle of the 10th century, the scale hoard, a few decades later perhaps. The first observation is, once again, that to engage in these kinds of enterprises, this kind of piratical lifestyle, costs a lot of money. I mean, the scale hoard, of course, is 8 kilograms of silver or more. And the second is that we are dealing with a warrior aristocracy milieu, where silver is being used to maintain a retinue. And the third is that we are dealing with, at this point, of course, perhaps 100 years in, perhaps a bit less than that, where there is a self-conscious local political economy which is creating a new, consciously anachronistic form of exchange that is ring money, the plain silver rings like we see here in the Bury hoard, with references back to early Scandinavian prototypes. What about ecclesiastical sites? Well, this is fascinating again, because what we're seeing is the pagan period increasingly squeezed. Where on the one hand, Rachel Barrowman's recent publication of the reanalysis and re-excavation of St. Ninian's Isle, along with Catherine Forsyth's work on the relevant ogons, is pushing Christian practice at a site like this later and later and later, possibly even as late as into the 10th century. And on the other side of the equation, sites, in this case a site known for some time, the Rock of Dyrnes, which probably has a chapel phase dating to more or less the middle of the 10th century, is pushing the Christianization on the other end earlier and earlier. So that what one has is a very, very brief, or what must have been a very, very brief period of pagan practice, which is, of course, also the message that we're getting from the chronology of the graves. But it's also potentially corroborating that late date of that Scandinavian enterprise and the early end of the chronology with St. Ninian's Isle. And probably a certain amount, of course, of complicated shared and contemporary belief systems. Okay, what about settlement sites? Well, the first observation is that, of course, there are lots of them now. We have a lot of excavated Viking Age and medieval sites in the Northern Isles, more, in fact, than are shown on this map. The second is that these islands themselves were probably relatively densely settled at the beginning of the colonial process. If we use the late medieval taxation evidence, in the 15th century, there were probably at least 2,000 households in Orkney. Of course, it's difficult to say how that relates to the Viking Age, because there would have been both settlement growth and settlement contraction in the intervening period. The High Middle Ages, and the era of the Black Death, etc. But if we use those 2,000 households as a starting point, clearly settler colonialism of that Orkney alone would have been a non-trivial enterprise. And if we look at the character of these settlements, we see that they are making unambiguously Scandinavian references. Architecture is the most obvious form. And I'm not talking about the presence of rectangular architecture, about which there was much discussion some decades ago, but three-aisled construction of a typical North Atlantic hall-style house. And these are just two examples of excavated myself at the Rock of Dyrnes and at Quager, one 10th to 12th century and one 11th to 12th century in date. The real trick with these settlement sites is their chronology. And that trick is, because most of them lack a lot of tightly contextually sealed metalwork or waterlogged deposits allowing dendrochronology, then on the whole we use radiocarbon dating. And the radiocarbon calibration curve, of course, which connects a particular radiocarbon determination to a particular calendrical date, has wiggles. And right at the beginning of the Viking Age, there's a very flat part of the curve, in the upper left we see here, which means it is essentially impossible to distinguish a late 8th century settlement from a settlement of almost 900 AD. if there's a real calendrical date, something happens anywhere in that range, it will get smeared with an error range that covers that entire band. So it is actually extremely difficult to, in radiocarbon terms, recognize an early Viking Age settlement, and that's methodologically very complex. It just so happens at the end of the Viking Age is the same problem, because in the lower down and to the right, in the late Viking Age, one has a 2-century period in the 11th to 12th century, which suffers from almost exactly the same problem. Now this means that on the whole, those sites which are potentially early are also in radiocarbon terms potentially late, if one looks at the error range on those terms. Now, there is really one site, to my knowledge. I'd be very happy, I'm always happy to be wrong, and it might be that today I'll discover I've missed the fundamental site. But the one site, to my knowledge, which could actually date very early, is Norwich from Unst, everybody that Ellen Smith has published on. But in that case, the dates which would take you the proper early side of this wiggle and plateau in the curve are on incrustations, food residues in pots, which almost certainly will be biased by marine reservoir effects and therefore anomalously old. And if one looks at the other dates from the same site, they bring you up into the 860s, 870s, 880s, comfortably into the period where we would think that settlement would have happened from the other sources I've discussed so far. Now, in the course of digging in the north, in part I tried to answer other questions having to do with the growth of long-range trade, for instance, but in part at the Brock of Dearness, I went looking to see, well, can we actually find this early Viking Age? Is it really there? And we've just not been getting it. The answer, at least in my hunt, is it's just not there. So now I'd like to take you through these two sites very briefly. The Brock of Dearness on the bottom of the picture here, and Cloyger at the top. Just to give you two examples, this is intended to indicate that these sites must tell the entire story of the process. Of course they cannot, but to give you examples of the situation in which we find ourselves, real-world examples. Well, the Brock of Dearness is a Pictish and then Viking Age promontory fort. It unfortunately isn't ecclesiastical, so far as we can tell, that it does have a private chapel. It's not a monastery. That's a story for another day. But these are the C14 dates. And what one sees, of course, is a Pictish settlement that picks up around 600 and stops right around 800. And then, fortunately, in this instance, we miss the plateau because there is a hiatus of occupation. And then the Scandinavian settlement picks up right around 900 and continues into some point in the 11th or 12th century, because of course, unfortunately, it does hit that second plateau, and we can't say whether it ends in the 11th or it ends in the 12th. It has houses of classic Scandinavian style in their internal layout. I showed you house 20 previously. This is house 25, which is dug into this pre-existing Pictish promontory fort settlement. But although it is self-consciously and self-evidently a Scandinavian settlement, it does adopt an insular model of the chiefly promontory citadel. It's the Berghead reference, the Gunseverk reference, the Dumbarton reference. It's a fortified site with a spatial hierarchy. This is, I think, a chiefly stronghold, but one which is facing outward threats rather than dominating an indigenous population. In that, I think by the time here we're dealing with something established around 900, that's potentially quite significant. There's a certain self-confidence about this kind of a monument at the same time that it is characteristic of perhaps paranoia of another kind. Living on the stack isn't terribly comfortable, I can say from personal experience. Now, what about the portable material culture from the site? But the Pictish material is very interesting, but it only occurs in the Scandinavian phase as residual finds in redeposited midden, for example. Otherwise, this is an assemblage, and these are just a few objects, which does not include Pictish objects, but which does include a remarkable mix of kinds of material culture from around the North Sea and the Irish Sea, and in fact Norway itself. So this is a very hybrid assemblage, if you like, from the 10th to 12th century date, that's representing a very mixed community, but one which is not choosing to make reference to the Pictish past which must have, of course, been the ancestry of many of the people living here around this site, if not on it, based, for instance, on the the modern DNA work that has been published over the last decade. What about Koivu? But this is a Viking Age and medieval farms. Rather than starting the Pictish period and ending in the Viking Age, it begins in the Viking Age and continues, in fact, until 1937, when the last tenants left the farm. Here, the chronology picks up immediately after that plateau, probably right about 900 in the 10th century. And this is just to keep it simple, one particular sequence, one trench at the site. The overall chronology is exactly consistent with this and continues in occupation, of course, thereafter. Yes, anyway, it's just making the point that it's missing the one plateau with getting caught in the other. Now, the portable material culture from this site is fascinating because in the Viking phase, almost all of it is not from the islands of Orkney. I mean, some of it's coming from as close as Shetland, where there are vessels being made in Norwegian and in fact, local Shetlandic style. But it's not from Orkney. Some of the objects are demonstrably from Norway, Eidsborg schist whetstones, for instance. But most of the material culture is in fact not locally provenanceable. There are clear Scandinavian associations being made here in more than just the architecture, which I've previously shown you. And it's very easy for that to dominate one's perception of the site, and I've certainly allowed it to do so. But one can look at it with different eyes, and one can find particular categories in small numbers of local, that is pre-Viking Age, Iron Age, Pictish, if you like, material culture, which continues. You know, the nail-headed pins, for instance, are perhaps worth mentioning, although they do change in form. But particularly these little utilitarian things like whalebone discs, which are characteristic of both the pre-Viking and post-Viking period. And one can see the same in terms of those aspects of the changes in economy, about which I've just talked for perhaps far too long, for 2 decades. And the first is the observation that there are really very dramatic changes. The introduction of very large-scale fishing, for example, there's no question about that. But at the same time, there are also local continuities. And one of the most important, though, is probably this tradition, which becomes intensified in the Middle Ages, of slaughtering cattle at a very young age, essentially neonatal calves, which is interpreted by many as a focus on a dairy economy, on the assumption that the calves would compete with humans for milk. Not everyone shares that interpretation, but the reality is that there are people who are killing a lot of calves. But in fact, that is a very deeply rooted tradition, and there's a point been made by Terry O'Connor in a recent review of animal bone assemblages across Northern and Western Europe throughout the early medieval period, where he notes the fact that it's actually unusual to find this pattern. It isn't something that we should expect to be seeing as an introduction from Scandinavia. This is an indigenous pattern. And of course, the other aspects of farming fall into the same category. And one of the interesting things to come out of the Brock of Dearness excavation is that we had gradually convinced ourselves that the crop of flax was introduced by the Scandinavians because it becomes more abundant in Viking Age and later period settlements in the Northern Isles. But we have direct dating on flax seeds from the Pictish phase, which are clearly 7th century, for instance. So this is yet another aspect. So we have to imagine that many aspects of the agricultural economy are in fact demonstrating continuity rather than change, at the same time, of course, that one's seeing change. Right, okay, well, where does that lead us? Well, probably in some fairly obvious places that I suspect you knew all along and I'm only discovering. The first is that perhaps it was actually quite rapid. I think we have to see colonization on present evidence as being something that happened quite late in the process, probably around the middle of the 9th century, maybe even the late 9th century, on a nice model which we'll come to in a moment, and unquestionably very, very costly. And that says something about the intentionality of the enterprise and the scale in which it must have been undertaken. The second is that, at least in the beginning, it was underpinned by a shared pagan ideology, the Laxavisa, if you like, of Torf Einar, of a warrior aristocracy, as expressed also, of course, in the pagan graves. The third is that in comparison to Norway, not in absolute terms, of course, but in comparison to Norwegian burial evidence, that it probably entailed a comparatively flat hierarchy, and if one accepts the evidence, in the first instance, things like the lives of Isa, but also later Orcadian tradition, like the creation of St. Magnus in opposition to St. Olaf and St. Canute in Scandinavia. One has this continuing tradition of resistance to an overarching royal authority. And this notion of the flat hierarchy also continues, of course, well into the Middle Ages, where one can see it in 12th century, good 12th century and early 13th century sources, where when Earl Harold Madison has to present himself in front of King Sverre of Norway because a rebellion of Sverre, which was entirely almost supported by people from the Northern Isles, failed, he gets away with it because he says the people of Orkney do not always do as I wish. And it's a series of independent magnates that perhaps we're seeing continuing echoes of all the way down the system. Of course, it's characterized by othering. Colonial settlement always is, and we see, again, echoes of that in the context of the later sources, like the Synoptic Histories, but also by assimilation of the indigenous culture. Because, of course, Pictish ancestry, people of Pictish ancestry are still there. They're just building different style houses, and on the whole, not exclusively, on the whole, using different kinds of stuff. Yet, it's not entirely immune to cultural continuities, ambiguities, and hybridities. And one could see that in the very occasional artifact form, as I've mentioned, and perhaps most strikingly in terms of agricultural production, accepting that there are also massive economic changes like fishing, but I think most clearly in the context of very rapid Christianization, if one compares a chronology between something like St. Ninian's Isle and the Rock of Dearness. Right, now what are the comparisons? And now I'm going to keep these brief for obvious reasons of time, but I think that they need to be made and that they tell us some useful lessons. And the first is the case of the Manx case is probably an exaggerated example of what I've just charted out for the Northern Isles. We have an instance where it's very late. The arguments are it's perhaps around 900. It's a case where the very first horizon is ostentatiously pagan, with this horizon a particularly aggressive mound and in one case boat burial. But a case where very rapidly that tradition is replaced by one of extremely hybrid monuments in the case of the rune-inscribed cross slabs with their syncretic iconography. And you know, in every way, it kind of telescopes the process, which I've just been suggesting is applicable to the Northern Isles. And now, what about the case of Iceland? Well, Iceland is actually different in the opposite direction, because it was an enormous undertaking. It was similarly late. Of course, the evidence is that it started in the late 9th century, not the middle of the 9th century. But by the 11th or 12th century, it is very likely that at least 50,000 people lived there. That's a lot of people. And that cannot be one William Alexander. It's just not possible. That must have been many, 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 many William Alexanders. So I think we have to envision it as quite a different phenomenon than what might have been possible in the Isle of Man, and perhaps with Orkney and Shetland being a bit of a halfway house. And now it's recently been suggested, some of you perhaps have read my response to it, I don't think entirely convincingly, that this actually remarkably happened incredibly quickly, you know, perhaps even within a few decades of 871, the land named Tefra, and that 24,000 people might have already been there within 20 years. I'm not sure that we can go to that extreme of view. You can make up your own opinions, of course, but the message is the same. That these colonial endeavours could be very, very substantial in scale. And of course, the thing about the Icelandic example is that it's the Icelandic example, or more specifically, the medieval Icelandic memories of that example, as represented in High Medieval Saga tradition, that has created this kind of utopian notion of that North Atlantic colonial enterprise to begin with. And that allows me to end on what I hope is a kind of cautionary tale about taking the sorts of enterprises, the sort of discussion we're taking trying to chart out too far. And in saying that, I'd like to end on a second anecdote that's just a little bit different. This is my copy of Volsunga Saga, produced by William Morris. This particular copy is undated, but it was probably printed in the 1880s. William Morris, as many of you will know, is an extraordinary polymath and proponent of the arts and crafts movement. He did something else at the same time that he was producing translations of sagas. He wrote a utopian text called News from Nowhere. And this notion of that expeditionary voyage into the uncharted waters of the North Atlantic by these free-spirited Vikings, of course, is a mythology as well as having elements under perhaps the more prosaic and not always as attractive settler colonialists, which underpins it, but is very, very heavily shaped by that subsequent mythology. And as we attempt to unpick these various strands, it's always going to be a challenge in which, of course, will never be completely successful to shift, to sift one from the other. So in ending there, I'd like to thank the many people who are responsible for making these excavations happen, and particularly to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland for making a really remarkable event happen today. Thank you.